They're really starting to put a damper on my James Bond fantasy.
Good. Because this isn't a game.
Welcome, friends, new and old. Here we are talking Quantum Leap Season 2 of the Revival series. Somehow we're all the way up to Episode 8, which apparently, unbeknownst to me, is the mid-season finale. But here we are. This one is entitled Nomads. Other places on the internet call it Nomad. I'm going with the plural because A, that's what's on Peacock, and B, that just makes a lot more sense pertaining to this episode. But before we get into that, there will be spoilers ahead. Take this as your last warning if you want to get out before those. Otherwise, let's crack on with the show. So I am sorry this is late. I had a little bit of a computer issue as well as just being insanely lazy, but here we are. Let's crack into it. So last episode, we left off with that whole witch trial thing. I thought that was a fairly weak episode. I didn't hate it. It just had no real forward momentum, and the actual Leap storyline, which is generally what I want to spend the most time with, was just kind of flat and uninspired. But this episode is basically the antithesis of that. There was so much to see and so much to do in the Leap itself. There was a lot of forward momentum and progression as far as the overarching storyline, character development, and all of those things. Nomads is an apt title for a couple of reasons, especially considering the plot of this episode is that Egyptian spy story taking place in the 60s, and Ben is now sort of kind of trying to live out his whole James Bond dream, finding out that spy work isn't all it's cracked up to be and that it's harder. And we get one of those patented, basically it's something that I guess season 2 of Quantum Leap is doing a lot more than the first season of this revival, where they kind of seem to almost give us that bad ending, I guess you could say. Everything's gone wrong, everything has failed, it looks like everything's just going to be thrown out the window, and this is the end of Ben's leaping, only to have it miraculously turned around at the last moment. And I have to imagine they keep doing this, they're setting us up, they're giving us the expectation that inevitably things are going to turn around, and one of these times, one of these leaps, everything is going to go wrong, and it's not going to be this magical turnaround. Being the mid-season finale, I'm a bit shocked they didn't actually pull that trick here. We'll get back to that a little bit later on because I want to talk about the Hannah of the room.
Ben? Is that you?
She is back again. I believe it's the third time this season. It does definitely seem like she is going to become this very main character, I believe, not just in the leaps themselves, but I think there's more going on behind the scenes as far as the overarching storyline, the setups for her possibly even creating another organization or working for another organization have been kind of hinted at because she's got this background in science, this background in a photographic memory. She's dealing with stuff outside of her time frame, so she's getting information from Ben from the future. She's kind of dealing with all of these situations, moving through time linearly, but there are these giant gaps where she must be doing something with that information, whether or not she's trying to somehow behind the scenes work on a way to get Ben home, or she's the one that inevitably starts the Quantum Leap program, or she's kind of overhearing this stuff and trying to prevent it from happening. There are lots of possibilities, but this episode kind of lays the groundwork for a little bit more. So every time she's been involved, it's kind of pivotal stuff, if you ask me. Very shady government organization with Area 51. You've got the bad guys from Germany. Now we have a similar storyline where it's kind of sort of remnants of the bad guys from Germany that are now working as spies in the Middle East. So these aren't your average garden variety Ben trying to just leap in and change the lives of, a family that's going through a divorce or something. A lot of those personal stories that the original Quantum Leap were based around. Which, setting Hannah aside for a moment, I want to touch on that point because Ben is now making these grand changes to the timeline that aren't just little small ripples. He is changing the geopolitical infrastructure of the entire planet time after time after time. So like I mentioned earlier, we have that Area 51 thing. We have a lot of shady spy stuff going on. Specifically this episode, he saves Layla, who was a very influential spy during this time, who in the original timeline was never even discovered, so nobody knew who this spy was. They thought it was a mystery, a man. They thought it was just a myth, I guess you could say. But in this timeline, not only does he save her life, he gives the CIA the revelation of who she is, allows her to defect. She comes with all of this information she's been accumulating over the years. Not to mention that at the very end, it's mentioned that she is responsible for dismantling the entire Soviet spy network in the Middle East. That is a grand scale change to the entirety of the politics and the stability of the planet. So you couple that with a lot of the other things that have already been done, especially let's look at season 1, where Ben changes the course of history with Addison's father, that military stuff going on. Not to mention the first episode of this season, which was even referenced very briefly in this episode, where he leapt into that ragtag A-team group of people doing that spy work in Russia. Don't really think it was spy work, but whatever it is, all of these things must have had drastic changes to the political landscape of the world that the Quantum Leap program in our present day is currently interacting with. Well, I say present day, it's actually 3 years in the future now. Not that they've really touched upon that or even referenced the fact that it's technically, I guess, 2025, 2026, depending on if they're following real world time, but again, I digress. I don't think that's necessarily that pivotal or important to the show. So all of these changes are now getting grander and grander. Add to that the fact that he's dealing with Hannah in what appears to be a linear way. So this isn't going to be a River Song from Doctor Who thing where he keeps running into her out of time. It seems like he is progressively going from leap to leap to leap. Every couple of leaps he runs into her in chronological order. It is their third time meeting for each of them. It's just a lot more time in between for Hannah. And this episode seems to be implying, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seemed to be showing that she is now intertwined with him as far as other agencies know outside of our future Quantum Leap people, because she was very, very much linked to the spy op. She was seen. She must have been either recorded or photographed or even just seen by people, not just on the good side, and I'm assuming that Lou Diamond Phillips is still on the good side at the end of the episode. So Layla and Lou Diamond Phillips, forget me, I forgot his name, but I'm just going to call him that. They go off into the sunset at the end, kind of fulfilling that saving her from Egypt thing. And he knows, because obviously he saw her. Layla knows because they directly met on a couple of occasions. And even if that wasn't the case, the bad guys saw and interacted with her on a couple of occasions. So now all of these spy organizations know that this woman, this Hannah, who works for the US government doing top secret science that was related to nuclear stuff to begin with Einstein. So they know that this very smart woman is now involved in international espionage. I have to imagine if she isn't already engaged in some secret scientific stuff with a shady organization or in a benevolent organization, they are now going to be getting in touch with her because she was so intertwined with this. And they even specifically show a scene where after Ben gets the news that Layla is alive, he doesn't hang up the phone.
She's trapped somewhere now, and they're looking for her. Layla's alive.
I knew it.
They were kind of dropping these hints and clues, at least in my estimation, that she is going to be wrapped up and involved in something else. And the next time they meet, potentially, I don't know if it's going to be laying a trap or if this is in relation to the stuff we learn at the very end of the episode, where suddenly Tom gets a call that they've come across this long-lost hard drive with some partially fragmented data on how to get Ben home. That all seems a little bit too coincidental to not be playing into the overall storyline of Ben drastically altering history. And then they also tie in that whole love will save the day. Love is the reason that the Quantum Leap Accelerator is drawing these two people together. I'm not necessarily certain that's the case. I like that explanation. It adds that more metaphysical God-type level of the original Quantum Leap that we have rarely gotten in this show because they tend to try to rely on the science of it a little too much, but I do like that. I also was a little bit icked out, and I mentioned this in my previous Hannah episode, whereby Ben is inhabiting somebody else's body. Because they did away with the sort of kind of maybe body swap that they did in the original, Ben is now energy inhabiting someone else's body. So they've kissed. It was implied they did more than kiss in this episode, which by itself is a little bit ethically dubious and a little bit ethically questionable just in and of itself. But then they also go into this whole thing about, well, maybe when you fail a leap, you're stuck in that time forever, and maybe that'll just be the grand reward that you'll just stay here forever, living out your life back in 1960 with Hannah and all of this stuff, not even taking into account the fact that Ben is in somebody. If that is the case, He has, for all intents and purposes, just murdered and replaced this person, and for the rest of history, for the rest of time, he will be taking the place of this person, regardless of the fact that this person may have a family, friends, a very important career and job that he has no training and no way to even do, and he is now going to replace that person and live out his life with this other woman who, as far as anyone who knows the person Ben is now inhabiting, does not know and is now completely overriding this guy's life. I know I just went on a side tangent there, but that's all I could think about when they were talking about this is Ben's grand reward, and maybe that's the same thing that happened to Sam. He just took over someone's life, and that's what he did with the rest of his time, which also doesn't make sense, because if that is the case, how did he not ever, I don't know, write a letter to the Quantum Leap facility to let them know that, hey, I'm alive back here? But whatever, I digress. Not the point of the episode, but it's just the type of stuff that floods my mind. I also forgot to mention that apparently Addison and Ben have now completely mended their relationship for the most part, and Addison and Tom are almost sort of maybe going to get married, even though he didn't ever really get around to proposing, so we'll see how that goes. I still think all that backstory surrounding Tom's original wife is going to come back into play, because they wouldn't have dropped that if it wasn't, but it seems like for the time being they're trying to tie all of this up into a fancy bow and telling us everybody's okay, everybody's great, so they're definitely going to rip something away from us very soon. We have so many lingering plot threads from season 1 that have not even really been referenced in this season, and I have to imagine they're all going to kind of come together at some point. Martinez, the evil Leapers, the future stuff, the apocalypse, the other Leapers out there. We know there's at least several. The alternate timeline that Addison originally was a Leaper and was saved from. All of these things seem like they could be tied up in the changes Ben is making, and it seems like there is a lot more going on with Hannah in the past. But what do you think of all of this? How did you find this episode? Where do you think we're going in the future? Whatever it is, leave all your thoughts down below. Like, share, subscribe, do all those fancy YouTube things. I know I forgot to mention at least 32 things I wanted to talk about here, but that is what it is. Until next time.
Everyone's a liar, looking for someone to trust, and they are all terrified of betrayal because they betray for a living.